Greetings everybody, welcome to this video. Thank you so much for pressing on the play. First of all, I would like to mention the origins of this video. Since my mother passed, I felt a strong urge to say more about her life in the form of a sort of eulogy, to showcase her in the way that anyone would about a loved one, but a bit more at length, which I was able to do. That in turn led me to think, and as I searched through my files and found my mother's handwritten notes on her life in Nigeria, I was urged by an internal force to act to bring her life in Nigeria to more people and try to publish her booklet that she didn't get a chance to flesh out. And some of you might already have had chance to look at that in the array of choices of the recordings I've made. One of them is My Life in Nigeria by my mother. Once I had completed that, another urge, an intuitive voice spoke to me about what about my mum's origins in Wales, given that I had covered her middle period of her life in Nigeria, almost 30 years. It got me to thinking of her life in Wales, and as I researched her life in Nigeria, I was looking through a lot of photographs and was coming across all these wonderful images of her life before she went to Nigeria. And I thought I should really perhaps showcase my mother and where she came from better. But that in turn led me to think, well, what about after Nigeria? She had another spell to her life where she basically was a world traveler, mainly to follow me, because I lived in many different locations. And I thought, what an interesting episode that she had in that part of her life, leading up to 90. And so here I have a very ambitious recording to cover the Welsh part of her life before she went to Nigeria, and the travelling part of her life after she came back from Nigeria, from her base in London. That's where she travelled from. So if I am able to do this all in one go, it will probably be the longest presentation that I've ever embarked upon, but I'll see how I go. As I've mentioned in other recordings, thank heavens I like presenting. And one of the things I could say is that this is an unconventional, because we are more used to, perhaps if we are presenting, standing up and pointing to slides or saying, next slide please. But of course in this setup I will have to physically present the images to you, and you will see how I do that. It's the best possible way only possible way I can do it at the moment. Who knows in the future whether I could have a voice and have the slides electronically changing on the screen. But for now, this is why I'm speaking to you, and I will summarize here in my own hand what I've just said to you. So hopefully this makes a framework. So as I come a little bit closer, I think you can see it's handwritten. It just occurred to me before the recording to summarize this. So you probably know that my mother, when she passed this year, was 92. So she was born in 1930 and she passed away in 2022 this year. So as I've just said, we will cover 1930 to 1960, which is 30 years. And A, if we just look down, is Wales and Nottingham. And then in the middle, we've got the Nigeria adventure, which was 28 years, but I've made it roughly 30 years. There was a year of 28 to 29 years and a year in London at the end. Just to make it simple, I've made it 30. And then there was this third 30-year period of 1990 to 2020. Another 30 years. So it's quite, when we look into our lives and those of others, there's certain harmony and rhythm of the 30 years before Nigeria, the 30 years roughly in Nigeria, and the 30 years after. I stopped in 2020 because from 2020 to 2022, my mother suffered from ill health. And that might be a subject for another video of that special last part of her life where she was not able to be her usual self. So that second part B is World Traveller. So as I sit here, I'm going to try to describe my mother's origins, her life in Wales and Nottingham, where she met my father. We shall skip Nigeria, it's already been covered, and I shall attempt to describe all her numerous travels. A 60-year presentation, so wish me luck and let's see how I can go. So having set the scene, well, I will actually further set the scene just a little bit more before we go to my mother's origins, because I'd like to show you where we will ultimately cover of all the places that my mother visited. So this sets the scene from her Welsh origins and where she lived for 30 years and in Nottingham. The next 30 years was down in Nigeria. She also flew from Kano. So all the dots, you'll see the places that my mother lived. And then her travels beyond when she went back to London from 1990 to 2020, the last, more or less the last 30 years. These were the areas she visited without getting into detail. Australia, Southeast Asia, Qatar, where I am recording this. And what I did miss out is when my mother was young, she had various trips into Europe. She covered Europe quite well. And we went as a family to Rome. She also visited Las Palmas, took us on holiday there. So just to see where Mrs. Omotoso roamed, and you can even see all the traveling she did around Australia. For those of you that don't have time to watch all the details, you can get a general idea of her life after all that time in the UK and Wales, then all that time in Nigeria, and then after she came back from Nigeria, a lot of traveling all the way out here. And then apart from that, she did one trip in 1990 to visit her very dear friend, Dorcas. She took a trip across to Atlanta. And I'm very pleased that my mother did manage to cross the Atlantic as well, all the way across to America, that she got to see that as well in her life. And that was the footprint of my mother's life and all the places she went that I hope to cover in some more detail as we go along. My energy notwithstanding. So my mother's origins is that she is from Wales, from North Wales specifically, where she was born on the 8th of May 1930. You will see that her mother was actually English from the Shrewsbury area, and I think that's why when my mother was growing up they did not speak Welsh in the household. But she always thought of herself as Welsh, but I have to sort of, being a bit of a pedantic chap, to not miss anything out and just honour all the parts. So as we look at the very Great Britain that has put such a stamp on the world, just in case any of you forgot where it was, there we have the UK in all its glory, sitting next to Europe. And as we home in, some of you, and I hope that the World Cup team will put Wales a bit more on the map, we home in and we can finally see that little division there. And Wales nestled all the way in the west. I think they pushed us all the way back and almost pushed us into the sea. But thank heavens the invaders left us a little bit of land there. There is that beautiful land of Wales. We get a little bit closer. It's a little bit of a geography lesson there. Suddenly you can see an orange dot. Now that's where my mum comes from. That's where she was born, in the northern part of Wales. I hope that's coming through. And you can see a little bit of a yellow dot there. Her mother hailed from the Shrewsbury area. around about there, Ironbridge, Shrewsbury, that general area. I remember my mother telling me, thank heavens I listened. So we home in a little bit further. I've learned a lot from doing this presentation of, oh look, Birmingham's over there. I always wondered where it was. And there we are again, still in the North Wales. I hope this is coming across so you can see. And just across the border, people didn't travel very far then, so it made sense that my grandfather would have met his English wife from nearby, because they were quite close to the border. Now we're still homing in on the northern part of Wales, and you can still see this area where my mother came from, called Acrefair, which is Acrefair, with a funny spelling like acre fair, but pronounced Acrefair. Welsh is quite a language, I must say. Suddenly we've got a little pink bit over there, and guess what? That's where yours truly was born, just inside Wales. So apparently I'm a Welshman. The name of my town of birth was Chirk, and we shall visit that on our travels. What, 10 to 15 miles down the road? There must have been a good hospital, and that's where my mum went to have me. So homing in even further, Rus. Suddenly I'm framing Acrefair. We're diving in a little bit now. There's Chirk where I am. This is Llangollen, which is quite a famous town for singing. They have a singing competition over there. This is Rus. I can't pronounce the full name, and this is where they have fabulous choirs. And at my mother's funeral, the male Welsh choir sang the national anthem, and we played that in my mum's funeral. And over here is Wrexham, which is one of the big towns. If you wanted to do major shopping, you could go to Wrexham. But here, this is the area where my mother is from, Acrefair. So still diving in even further, we are now getting right to the topography of the place. And there's a river that runs along here called the River Dee. Such a beautiful river, and Llangollen is also along here. And the road to get there is beautiful along the river. And so here we are in Acrefair, homing in yet further on it. So now finally we're in the place of my mum's birth, Acrefair. And you can see I've circled in a square rather, the exact house for which I shall share pictures of where my mother was raised. I don't think she was born in the house, but I'm not sure. And here's a cemetery just across the road where my grandparents are buried. And I did go to visit that with my mum, which is just wonderful. I have some pictures to show you. He used to ride his bike around here, and he worked over here at W.T. Evans. He had the weekly newspaper. It was called a Chronicle, the Acrefair Chronicle. He was a printer, and I'm very proud to say that his name was W. William Tompkin Evans, and his printing house, W.T. Evans, is still running. I visited it, took Mum to see it, and I'll show you pictures. W.T. Evans is still on the map, but it all started from my grandfather over here, whom I resemble in a very large way, as you'll see later on. I take after him in so many ways. So, dear Grandpa, I'm channeling, and I forgot to ask Mum and Dad, please guide me as we go along this long presentation. And also, I think, my grandparents as well. Evelyn and William, you'll see. So now we home in even further. Gosh, how I fondly remember it. It may not mean too much to you, but here we are again with the house I'll show you. The cemetery where my grandparents are buried, where I went to school at the age of 6 to 7 because we had to leave Nigeria because of the Civil War. If any of you watched that, you will know that we had this wonderful trip. And this is why I speak with great care and fascination, because I remember it very well. That silver lining of fleeing from Nigeria was I got to know this land of my origin, where I come from, which is so valuable to me. And through doing this exercise of mapping out my mother's life and her travels, I have to tell you, it certainly grounded me. And I feel much more organized in my makeup and being. So I've got a lot out of the exercise in sort of really knowing where I come from. and also reliving the rich past that I've had with my mother that you'll see. And if any of you last till the end, you think, I think I know why Peter and his mother were close, because of all the things we did. So now this, I've left no stone unturned, obviously, and I've gone to aerial photographs, and what I want to show is a W.T. Evans. We'll look a bit closer, and there he is, his shop again. He used to come and ride his bicycle all the way, and here it's very hilly, big hills. He used to ride. He must have been quite fit to get his bike up these very steep parts to go up here. And I toured Wales twice with my mother. You see the photographs as part of our extensive travels. So there was the house. I hope I'm pointing to the right place. And there was that's the cemetery, which is very important. Just imagine living across the road from where you know that you're going to be buried. It must have been an unusual feeling. And over here, this big sort of scar in the earth, yes, you can probably see, I'm glad I remember this, was a huge factory called Monsanto. And we all know about Monsanto. Last 10, 20 years, they used to be called the most evil company in the world, with all their GMO seeds and putting little farmers out of business and being cutthroat. Well, even here they spewed chemicals into the air, and my grandmother died at the age of 59. And people always did think it was the chemicals that injured the health of the environment here. Yet another black mark from Monsanto, but now it's just a scar in the earth. They left many years ago, thank heavens, and are gone. But who knows whether that's true, but it was, both of them died from cancer, and she died so early. So now I think is the time to actually show you my grandparents before they had my mother. So this is where it all started. William Tompkin Evans and Evelyn Evans, before my mother was born. And there is my grandfather and my grandmother. So when I was at the age of 6 to 7, I met my grandfather. He would have been 64 at the time when I met him, 65, because it was, no, that's not true. He was about 69, because he died 3 years later at 73. He was just turning 70 when I met him. But I didn't know her because she died so early. And I'll tell you the dates. So there they are. Some of you might see a resemblance to myself, although I was taller. So outside the house that I've ringed in, I shall present it a little bit better now. I think we've already seen the W.T. Evans, where he worked, was there. That's the terrain. But I'll home in now, on back to the house. They had long, the houses had long gardens, long thin strips that went across like that. And the cemetery oh, I see what's on. Now that makes sense. Now that makes a lot more sense. The houses had long, thin strips. Exactly, that's right, along here. And the cemetery was down here. And up here was the school. I would walk up and along and up and get to the school. I remember it well in the snow. And this is where my father came to meet me once, which I mentioned on another video, which was a fantastic memory of walking as a child from here up to school and Dad meeting me. And this was the cemetery which we went to look for their graves when we found them. So now that house with the long strip, outside that house, this is what the house looks like because it's still there. There it is. That's the house where my mother was raised. I'm not sure she was born in the house. And it's a sneak preview because guess who's walking towards the house all those years later? My mum. And I'll take you through that, how we came to visit again. But this is the best picture I have of the house. Not the one on the end, this one here. And you'll see, I remember walking through the gap in the houses. There was a railway bridge here. So now if I take you back 80 years to maybe 2038, how old would my mother have been? Standing outside that same house, we have, I give you, Elizabeth. And with her sister Bronwyn and her sister Mary. I didn't even know I had this picture. As I did my research, I must have stored it in a subdirectory somewhere and forgotten that I had it. I was so delighted to see my mum. I hadn't seen that picture for so long. So that's one of the sweetest pictures I have of my mum as a little girl standing outside that same brick house. I hope it's in the middle, holding a dog. I didn't even know they had a dog. But there she is, all those years ago, growing up in North Wales. And here, they must have gone for a trip to, no, I'll skip now, back to, here we are, not outside the house. Some years later, as a young lady, there she is with her father. You can see the top hat this gentleman's wearing. I checked the background, it's not the house, they must have gone somewhere for an outing. And there's my mum sporting, she sported that hairstyle for a while. I've seen others where she had it to the side. And there's my grandfather who wasn't the tallest of men, but I recognize his facial features are very similar, or I am very similar to his, I should put it the right way around. He was a very straight down the line man and a man of God. And upstanding, I think is the word. So we go along a little while and we have some photos here of my mum. These featured in her order of service, but it's nice to see it a bit closer. And you can see there was a gap. There was quite a gap between my mum and her two sisters, and consequently mum told me many times that she spent a lot of time with her dad and was very close to him because her mum had her hands full with the younger two who came later. Auntie Bronwyn and Auntie Mary, both of whom were the most wonderful aunts, and I loved them both very dearly. Auntie Bronwyn was just full of kindness and always so hospitable when we used to visit her in Wales, and was a dear, dear, beautiful person, as was my Auntie Mary here, who sent us packages of comics when we were in Nigeria and treated us as if we were her own children. She didn't have children of her own, and she was in Nottingham and I would visit her when I was a university student, and she was a very generous person, generous spirit, and a beautiful person physically as well. She was a doll. All the sisters were nice though. And when they both passed, I miss them dearly, as I do with my mum, and I think of them often. Blessings to my Auntie Bo and my Auntie Mary. So this part of the world that I forgot to point out, before I go any further though, here, I keep mentioning the cemetery across the road. So when my mother and I visited, it took us a while to find, but we found the tombstone. And Auntie Evelyn was, Grandma Evelyn was buried first, and William Tompkins Evans was buried second. And I would just like to honor, especially my grandmother that I never knew. It was the day of her birth yesterday, the 11th of the 11th, a very powerful number. She was born on the 11th of November, 1903, and died August 19th, 1962. She was only 59. And my dad's father, William, was born on the 6th of September, 1897. Can you imagine? All that time ago. And died June the 28th, 1970. I remember when he died, my mother went back. And he was 73. And I met him in 1967 when he was 70. What an honor to have met him. And there they are. Blessings to my wonderful grandparents. I'm so proud. And on that note, I will also mention the grandfather of my father, the chief Bale. He was also a very formidable man, a true chief. My grandfather on the other side, and I met him several times and would go down out of respect. But my father's mother, who was a very attractive looking woman, I have only a few pictures of her, one I think, and I didn't know her. She also died young. So both my grandmothers I never knew. But one of the things that was famous for, this area was famous for, which I shall just show you as I rustle here a little bit. You can see the orange. I use a color code for orange is where places we've lived, and yellow I always use for places we visited. Well, out here you can see some blue, and it's the end of the canal. And as you go just on the end, there's this magnificent aqueduct which carries a thin canal across, and that's how they used to cross the valley with goods being transported through this canal system. It would have just been the end of the canal, but this Isambard Brunel, this genius civil engineer from the 18th somethings, 1860 or something, created this fantastic piece of work, and just have a look at it. So we used to walk from our house to see this aqueduct. People come from all around to look at it. What an engineering masterpiece. Here we go. Ready? Look at that. Look at that. So when my mother subsequently twice went to North Wales, which are some of the most special trips, we went to that aqueduct and walked across it, scary as well. I was so pleased that we went there. And the two trips with my mother, I tell you, we not only once, it was so amazing, I said, let's do it again. Have really sort of grounded me in my origins, so I couldn't be more happy. So I'll just keep looking. So during this time, talking about, so those are the origins of my mother and where she comes from, the fabulous North Wales, which tends to be more Welsh in its identity. I don't want to be controversial, but they're more into the language, kind of more, a little bit slightly removed from the overwhelming cultural influence of England. And as you move to the western side, you get Snowdonia and you get the mountains, and I didn't get into that too much. But when my mother and I travelled to Wales, we did visit Snowdonia in the north, but not near the border, off to the sea side towards Ireland. But I have here in my notes that so now around about 1950, when Mum was 20, Mum would have started some form of teaching, maybe as a pupil teacher or training teacher, or that was what she has decided to be. And my dear Beryl, who's known her since the mid-50s, 1955, would have known about Mum's teaching history better, but I haven't had time to ask her. But so from around 20 to 25, before she started teaching, my mum would have traveled, and she would have been from 20 to 25. I say that because I know she met my dad around 25 years old. And she would have stopped traveling around Europe because she'd met my dad. So let's just say that from 20 to 25 to cover the life of my mother. And what did she do in her life? Where did she go? It occurred to me that she started moving around 20 to 25. And if we just look at our map, home in a little bit, we will be able to see I've put some leads here, especially to Turkey, because I remember her telling me how wonderful Turkey was. So I knew she got to Turkey. Sometimes you wish you'd listened a bit closer. And I know she got to Greece. She knew the Greek islands. She certainly would have gone through France. I don't remember her mentioning Germany. I think she went to Austria. So basically that's why I put a dot in Austria right in the middle. And I think I was pointing to the wrong place for Turkey. Yeah, that's Turkey over there. So let's just say Mum's covered Europe when she was a young girl, before she met my dad, the travels of Mrs. Omotoso. And it did her well. I also have a sneaking suspicion that she traveled with my Auntie Monica, because when we left for Nigeria in 1960, Auntie Monica went to see Mum off. And Auntie Monica still lives in the Cotswolds and is close to Mum's age, maybe a couple of years younger. And thankfully, she's still with us. My dear Auntie Monica. And she would have crossed to Shrewsbury, perhaps the town across I showed you earlier in England, where her origins were, where they made the first bridge, Iron Bridge. There's a town near there. Later, I had a friend who went to an international school there, and I did visit the Shrewsbury area. And so that was very fortunate that I toured the land of my origins. I'll just bring this map out a bit to point something out, because if we are from, here we are, we would sometimes visit Chester, where they had a zoo. And Chester has those lovely buildings with black and white, like Henry VIII type style. Tudor buildings, which are so nice. And look, Liverpool, just surprisingly close by. So not a million miles from where we were. So there's Shrewsbury, my English grandmother. But she more or less became Welsh. Wales, town of my birth. Liverpool, and then Wrexham, the big town. So this was the neck of the woods where we all lived. But it affords me the opportunity to also mention, if you're ever in the area, Snowdonia. You can see this big green national park and a peak. So now on one of our trips, I'm so blessed because we hired a car. I think it was the first of the 2 Wales trips. We crossed all the way and we visited an auntie in Porthmadog out here. And we drove through the top of the high plateau, not the peak itself. And the scenery was tremendous. And we stopped and picked some heather, which we kept for years. We had this heather sitting around in London, which we collected from our trip. And there's a train that goes all the way up the mountain top, which is worth seeing. I have not seen it myself. So seeing my auntie in Porthmadog, yeah, it is. Yeah, it's almost spelled like Port Mad Dog. I fondly remember seeing Auntie Betty. They're spelled B-E-T-T-I, and she gave me a coaster made out of slate for my tea and coffee. And isn't it funny, she gave it to me 12 years ago and I use it every morning, my Welsh slate coaster from Porthmadog. So I'm blessed to have experienced my origins, this wonderful, fabulous place which has a dragon as a flag. How cool is that? With my mother. And it taps me into half of who I am. Being doubly blessed to have 2 origins. Well, of course, we all have 2 origins. So when she was 25, at best as I can estimate, because I've tracked it back from my father arriving, and my detective work, I think, is reasonably correct, because now what I'm going to take us to is Nottingham, in the middle of England. I think I have a map to show where Nottingham is, but I prefer to just show you Again, I don't have a map exactly. Yes, let's have a look. Nottingham is placed in a very nice location. I think I shall mark it on here because it sits in the middle of the country and sort of anchors right in the middle. And I keep learning because I hadn't realized how close it was. It's just directly a line going to the east from Llangollen. There it is, Nottingham. Kept thinking it was a bit further south, but it's not. And 2 hours on the train. I've done that journey lots of times. 2 hours, 10 minutes. Speedy train up to Nottingham. And then as you go, you've got your Birmingham over there. Manchester's further north than I thought, and then you go all the way up to Newcastle, and then finally get to Scotland. But there she is. There's Nottingham. And that's why she probably chose it as a teaching centre, because she wouldn't have wanted to have gone too far from home. And so she ventured into Middle England and found herself teaching there when she was roughly 25. And little did she know what was in store for her. So tracking the detective word, my younger brother Simon had a Bible that my grandfather had given to Dad with some wonderful words, and fortunately he'd written on something, something, something since your arrival on to this country on, which is wonderful that he nailed the date because of those words. And that date was May the 25th, 1953, far earlier than I thought. So assuming he started university in September 1953, because that's when the terms would have started, let's say it was a 3-year course in civil engineering. I subsequently did the same course as my father, same university, and it was 3 years. So it was 3 years. He would have finished in September 1956. September 1956. And my brother was born in January 1958. 56, 57. So my brother was born a year and a half after my father graduated. So you could probably imagine they got married after uni. Sometime in, let's say they got married in 1957, and my brother was born in 1958. He probably wouldn't have got married whilst he was in uni. That fits, and let's say my mother met him in his last year, or just second to last year, just over halfway through the course. That means my mum met him in roughly 1955, whilst he was just past halfway through his course. Because I know he was in Nottingham University studying when my mum met him, and my mother would have been 25. What an absolute honey she must have been, judging from the pictures that you see. And she had ever-changing looks. She had different types of beauty. She really did. And she changed constantly and reverted back to her original beauty, as I claim later. As I shall claim to you later. So yes, I assume they married in 1957. So what I wanted to say is that when my father passed away in 2004, and they married in 1957, that means that they had been married for 47 years. Didn't quite reach the 50. What a glorious union. We do know of many other mixed marriages where the distance and the culture and extra tensions on the union made them not last that long. Oftentimes the lady would return back to Europe. Conditions were too harsh and other reasons. But my parents, I don't think they could have ever been without each other. There were periods of distance, but I remember once my father saying, "Ah, Betty," as if when I had cause to, without going into too much detail, the way he said that word was as if, "Do you think I would ever dishonor her or whatever?" It was quite it's the way people say things, isn't it? It's the way they say things. So I think they were really kindred to each other in their own way. So, so now, once they were married, they apparently bought a house from 1957 to 1960 it would have been, because we left in 1961 to Nigeria. I'm so grateful that I had the opportunity to do this, because I've sort of put the full timeline. I kind of knew these facts, but I hadn't really ever thought about it much. I thought, gosh, heavens above. And in fact, they lived at 100 Loughborough Road, West Bridgford. So now, but before we go there, we'll just home in and do the Nottingham thing. So now we know where Nottingham is. And now here we are. Now, these are the key parts of this Nottingham. Nottingham is extremely special to our family, because if not for Nottingham, there would have been no us. And this is the lovely university where I later went and was taught by the same lecturers as my father. Fantastic, beautiful university on a campus like out of the movies, big parks and lakes and things, wonderful, green. So this is very important. Down here is where they lived. This is West Bridgford. Nope, I'm going out the wrong way. This is West Bridgford. This is where they bought the house. 100 Loughborough Road. 100 Loughborough Road. Yes, you can look, you can Google it. And they were out here. Mum always said, oh, if we should have kept the house, it would have been worth a fortune by now. I always remember her saying that quite a few times. They didn't keep the house. And down here, I mentioned my beloved Auntie Mary, and this is where she was. I never realized how close she was to the uni in Clifton, just across the way. But I remember sailing down in a taxi on the motorway, and then like a freeway, a raised freeway. And this is and then we'd come off the freeway, and I'd go and visit my auntie for Sunday roast. And she cooked a wonderful Sunday roast. So it's just amazing how not important. Fancy Auntie Mary also settling there. The fact that I was in uni and I had my Auntie Mary that was there, and then the daughter of Auntie Bronwyn, Alison, who lives in Australia, she also came to uni 1 year after me. So she was just a year below me, and we overlapped for 2 years. And my parents met here. So Nottingham will forever remain with love in my heart. So I went to track down this West Bridgford 100 Loughborough Road. I'm surprised I hadn't done this before. And it was Beryl that told me this, the wonderful Beryl who knew her since 1955. But we'll look at that in a second. So as we home in a little bit more, you can now see we have the Nottingham campus, West Bridgford, 100 Loughborough Road, and my auntie again, and the Trent River going through. But I left that one important thing in the previous map. As we scale back out again, I just said how important this area was to us. It's even more important, because when I was in my second year, my younger brother came and went to this wonderful prep school, super posh Trent College, and so he was in Long Eaton, just a hop and a skip. And I'd go and see him, and I remember we went ice skating once. I would have been 16, and Sir Simon was only 12. Gosh, he was young. He was really young. He's 4.5 years younger than me, and I was, no. I was about 18 when he came, so sorry, I take that back. He was 14-ish, 13 to 14, still young. So look at that Nottingham, Middle England, held so much of a key to the Omotoso family. So here we are again. I've just gone over this map. So now I didn't have time to crop this 100 Loughborough Road. Just want to show you where it is again. Yes, sorry. So it wasn't bad, because this is the centre of Nottingham with the shopping centres, which I remember visiting, Victoria Centre, the Broad Marsh. So they would have come down here, and then they would have been, of course, quite a major road. Loughborough Road was quite a major road, but just to drop, because here we've been focusing on the uni, but the city centre, Nottingham's here. So they had a good location, perhaps a little bit of noise with the traffic, but there they were, near the centre, 100 Loughborough Road, as I keep saying. And where is 100 Loughborough Road? Make sure I've got the right one. It's this one. This house on the end, it's a duplex, so it's not the whole block, it's this half, this slither. There it is. You can get the idea of the road, and if I home in a little bit more, I was quite surprised when I saw it. There it is again. It resembles my grandfather's house, doesn't it? Very similar. Mum would have been familiar with it. And I do believe this is certainly the time they owned the house when Richard, my older brother, was born. And I'm not completely sure if he was born in the house. I don't know how they did it in those days. People will be thinking, no, Peter, they went to the hospital. But I'm not sure if he was born in the house. But anyway, he was brought home into that house when he was a baby, and that's where he saw his first years, in 100 Loughborough. There it is, eh? And if you look at it from the plan view, I've left no stone unturned. There's the street, little courtyard, the house itself, and as usual, that long garden thing that the Brits do. But the one in Wales was even longer and thinner. It went on about that long. So that was the home that they sold. I would also have been... I was born in Chirk, wasn't I? For some reason, Mum was in Wales at the time, in 1960. They must have sold and gone back to Wales. She did tell me the story of why they left Nottingham for Wales just before they left to Nigeria. For the next 30-year chunk that we're not covering in this video. We're covering the first 30 years and the last 30 years, or we're trying to. But homing in on the fabulous Nottingham University, where my father went and where my parents would have visited many times. They didn't meet in the university. They met in a place called the Nottingham Palais, which was a dancing hall, which when I was there had been converted, at least for the night I went, to a reggae night. And I think the whole venue had become Rastafari'd. And I do remember going there, and a waft of ganja fumes went past me. I think it was my first time ever there, and I looked out at the dance hall and I went, heavens, this is where they met. How times change. It was probably quite gentrified when they met, but I went to track down the Nottingham Palais where they met. Anyway, back to the university itself. You can see the lake. It's all green. Beautiful, beautiful. And this was the Hall of Residence, Hugh Stewart Hall, where my father went, and I also went to the same Hall of Residence, and he'd walk down there to the Civil Engineering Centre, which was named in honour when the man passed away, Professor Coates. It's called the Coates Building. And I had the honour to meet Professor Coates. He also taught my father, he taught me. He was a published, very accomplished civil engineer, and the whole thing's named after Professor Coates. Isn't that wonderful? And he says, I remember your father, because of the surname, you see. So Nottingham Uni is fabulous. If ever of you have aspiring children, I can recommend it. And of course, I shall prove my point by giving you a... how are we doing there? By giving you a full satellite picture, and you can see the greenery. You could get in little rowing boats and row along the lake. It's fantastic. They have this lovely Portland stone anyway, main administrative building. I got a bit carried away and I put the ring in the wrong place. Hugh Stewart Hall was this, not the circle, this wonderful old section and a new section, and then walking down here to the civil engineering department. Architecture was there, mechanical engineering, etc., but civil engineering took up a fair chunk of that. And I used to walk down there with great trepidation sometimes, thinking me against the world and how I would do these exams. And oh gosh, I took it so seriously to try to do well. And then we'd go through the parkland to various other halls. We had particular interest in the ladies' halls because they'd have dances, and some of them were mixed. So we'd go and drink and dance. at some of these parties, and it was quite a fabulous time, I have to say. Nottingham is a lovely place. So at the end of 1960 now, 61, I was 1. Richard was 4, Richard was 3.5. Dad had finished in Nottingham. He'd done some training with some civil engineering training, and he'd secured a job as a pupil engineer back in Nigeria. It was time to return home, and he was going to work with the Nigerian Railways. And that took Mum on a 28-year adventure. I'm sure she's so glad that she decided to have something different and reach out. With her mixed children and a very handsome husband, she headed on her way and had a wonderful 28 years, which is described in another video, plus her book, My Life in Nigeria, or her booklet, which I've outlined also with some maps and figures, but mainly the beauty of it is it's all in her own hand, and how she loved that place. And so just to set the scene, to cover the 28 years she was there, I'll just give this wonderful image, which I didn't get to show because I discovered it when I was researching for this video. Here we go, we're on the boat, but I'm trying to look, would it have been, is that me at 1? Because when we got to Nigeria, we did take the boat back the very next year. So I think this is probably not our trip out. I think I'm a little bit too old. I was only 1 when we headed out. This could, but just imagine it's the trip on the boat, because the romantic thing is it was always a boat. So let's take this as a symbol of beautiful bride takes her 2 lovely children out to Africa. And she looks happy and healthy. And they were such a wonderful couple. Both very attractive and very solid people, my parents. Not easily knocked off. Not easily knocked off their course. And so I'm all the richer for researching this, because I keep appreciating more and more. And how else can I represent the 28 years in Nigeria before we skip to the last 30 years of Mum as traveller and cover her travelling life? I guess the best way I can represent it is, out of those 28 years when I did that story, it surprised me to find that 10 years at the end were all in Ibadan, the city 100 miles north of Lagos, and the city of my father's origins in Yoruba land. That's where he comes from. He's an Ibadan man. And he built a house, so I think it was appropriate that after much traveling around Nigeria, if you watch that video, Mum finally settled for the last decade in the house that my father built before she finally returned to London and the UK. And my father followed her later. And this is our house that he built. Just from the outside, 4 Saka Agbaje Street, New Bodija. So that represents peace and a haven of stability for my mother and father as she went to All Saints Church School to teach. And then as she went to IITA, the Tropical Agriculture Research Place at the International School. And as usual, my mother enjoyed her life. She always made sure she enjoyed it somehow. Her stability followed her around. And I think you've heard me eulogizing her at length now, and also describing her accomplishments and her subdued accomplishments in Nigeria.